Lately, I've been feeling pretty uncomfortable with the person I'm becoming just to survive socially. This led me to the ill-fated adventure known as trying to be genuinely good in a world that punishes authentic kindness. So, to understand why I feel morally exhausted, I embarked on the mission of reading Dostoevsky's The Idiot. What I found was a brutal diagnosis of why truly good people don't survive contact with reality. In 1868, Dostoevsky created a disturbing literary experiment. He placed a man incapable of malice in the middle of Russian high society to see what would happen. Spoiler: the world completely destroyed him. And maybe that explains why you feel so tired of trying to be decent. Dostoevsky had a bold and almost impossible literary project. He wanted to create what he called a positively good man. Not a stained glass saint abstracted from human reality. Not a moral parable character who exists only to illustrate an edifying lesson, but a real human being functioning in the concrete world with genuine kindness as a central and irremovable personality trait. Prince Lev Nikolaevich Mishkin returns to Russia after years institutionalized in a Swiss sanatorium treating severe epilepsy. He never studied networking. He doesn't master the social games we learn in childhood, calculating advantages in every interaction. For us, it's automatic. For him, impossible. He's simply incapable of malice in the same way you or I are incapable of flying by willpower. Notice the word I chose, incapable. Not chooses not to be malicious as an exercise in moral development. Not tries to be good as a self-improvement project you start in January and abandon in March. He literally can't think in terms of manipulation, strategic advantage, social lies necessary to preserve harmony or protect status. When he meets someone for the first time, he sees a complete human being. When someone tells a story, he believes by default, without the protective cynicism we all develop. When he witnesses suffering, he feels automatic, reflexive compassion without going through the internal filters of, does this person deserve my empathy? Or, will helping here cost me something I don't want to pay? And the world labels him as such, not as a literary metaphor. Literally, concretely. From the first pages, everyone treats Mishkin as mentally deficient. The family that receives him treats him with the condescension reserved for children or people with severe cognitive limitations. Acquaintances talk about him in the third person, even when he's present in the room. Strangers assume they can easily deceive him, that they can exploit his naivety, but he's not stupid. On the contrary, he's surprisingly eloquent, deeply educated in European art and philosophy, capable of psychological analyses so precise about the people around him that he frequently makes them uncomfortable with the accuracy of his perception. So why this classification? Because he's fundamentally incapable of the three competencies that our civilization considers signs of functional social intelligence: strategic malice, calculation of advantages, and self-preservation lies. He trusts people without a track record that justifies trust. He believes in good even when all empirical evidence points to self-interest disguised as virtue. He doesn't defend himself when attacked because he simply doesn't interpret human conflict as a zero-sum game where he needs to destroy the other to guarantee his own survival. In the logic of the world, not specifically the Russian world of the 19th century, but the world as a social system that perpetuates itself through generations, this isn't admirable virtue. It's dangerous pathology that needs to be contained. French sociologist Émile Durkheim would develop decades later the concept of social facts, behavioral patterns that exist independently of individuals and exert coercion over us. Mishkin is incapable of obeying basic social facts: the necessary lie, the protective calculation, strategic cruelty. That's why he needs to be classified as sick. Dostoevsky forces us to confront a truth we'd prefer to keep implicit. We've built an entire society where genuine, spontaneous kindness, without calculation of return, needs to be reclassified as mental illness so we can continue pretending we're good while acting with calculated cruelty in the name of realism, prudence, protecting our interests and the interests of those we love. Think about how you behave in an important work meeting where decisions affect careers. You agree with ideas you find questionable because publicly disagreeing would create unnecessary friction, and mark you as difficult to work with. You praise mediocre or even counterproductive projects because the organization's internal politics requires demonstrations of mutual support. You don't say certain obvious truths because it's not the appropriate time, or because that wouldn't be strategic for my position. This isn't cynicism. It's not moral weakness. It's basic social competence that separates successful professionals from unemployed idealists. That's how functional adults operate in the real world, in simultaneous layers of truth and performance, always calibrating what can be said versus what needs to remain implicit. But now imagine someone in that same meeting who simply says what they think without political filter, literally believes what others say instead of interpreting through layers of implicit meaning, doesn't understand why everyone would be pretending agreement when they internally disagree. Your first assessment would be, this person has something neurologically wrong. They won't survive here. And you'd be right. Because Dostoevsky was asking a philosophical question disguised as a psychological novel. What if the entire structure we call civilized society is fundamentally incompatible with non-strategic kindness? What if all our institutions, from the job market to romantic relationships, from democratic politics to cultural production, are built on the tacit premise that everyone is performing some level of virtue while pursuing self-interest? And the person who doesn't participate in this collective performance breaks the entire system of social coordination. Mishkin enters St. Petersburg high society, a world of impeccable etiquette transmitted through generations, of performative charity that fills social columns in newspapers, of abstract philosophical discussions in literary salons where intellectuals debate morality while invisible servants circulate with French champagne. Everyone follows the rigid codes of good society. They demonstrate compassion for the poor as long as they remain abstract, distant, objects of institutional charity, and not concrete human beings asking for personal help. They discuss morality and social reform as long as it doesn't require changing the structures that guarantee their privileges. They value honor and principles as long as it's convenient to long-term self-interest. American sociologist Thorstein Veblen, Dostoevsky's late contemporary, would coin the term conspicuous consumption to describe how upper classes perform status through ostentatious spending. But Dostoevsky sees something deeper. High society doesn't just consume wealth conspicuously, it conspicuously consumes virtue. Morality becomes a commodity. Public demonstrations increase social capital. Real sacrifice, optional. But when confronted with concrete, non-performative kindness, Mishkin treating Nastasia, the woman with a past marked by society, with exactly the same dignity he treats Princess Aglaya, forgiving serious offenses without expecting anything in return, or even registering that he deserves gratitude. Loving people without calculating emotional or social return. These salon virtuosos reveal their true moral structure. They're cruel when cruelty protects position. They're calculating when they need to preserve status. They're selfish when genuine generosity costs something material or reputational. There's a revealing scene early in the novel that establishes the entire dynamic. Mishkin is visiting the Ivolgin family home, where everyone performs aristocratic politeness with choreographed precision. Ganya, a 28-year-old man consumed by social ambition but stuck in a mediocre bureaucratic position, is being actively forced by his own family to marry Nastasia Filipovna, a woman whose reputation has been irrevocably stained by years as the mistress of a wealthy nobleman, but who now brings a generous dowry of 75,000 rubles that would save the Ivolgin family from imminent financial ruin. The marriage is an obvious transaction. Everyone knows, nobody says. Her money buys his respectability, but they call it love and honor. Everyone in the room knows exactly what's happening. Everyone understands that Ganya is literally being sold by the family, and that Nastasia is buying access to social respectability that her money alone can't guarantee. And everyone accepts this hypocrisy as reality of life, as necessary pragmatism, as the way the world works for mature people. Mishkin simply sees. He sees Ganya's suffering being sold by the very family that should protect him. He sees Nastasia's humiliation being reduced to a commodity with a specific market value. He just recognizes the obvious that everyone pretends not to see. This makes him immediately dangerous. It destroys the system of shared meanings that keeps that room functioning. Because the society of hypocritical virtuosos functions on a sophisticated, tacit agreement that rarely needs to be verbalized. Everyone knows that everyone is pretending to different degrees, but no one can explicitly point out this collective performance without destroying the very social fabric. It's like stage magic. It only works as long as everyone collectively agrees, not to mention the obvious tricks. The person who breaks this coordinated silence, not through calculated rebellion, not through a desire to expose hypocrisy, but through literal neurological incapacity to participate in the shared lie, destroys the invisible social contract that allows systemic cruelty to continue operating smoothly with a clean collective conscience. Scottish philosopher David Hume argued in the 18th century that society functions not by rational agreement, but by tacit conventions that emerge organically. Dostoevsky takes this further. The most fundamental tacit convention of any functional society is the coordinated performance of virtue without the requirement of real virtue. Mishkin doesn't understand this basic rule. That's why he's as dangerous as someone who doesn't understand that we shouldn't mention that the emperor has no clothes. Nastasia Filipovna is perhaps Dostoevsky's most psychologically devastating creation. Her story is too common to be dismissed as a tragic exception. She was adopted while still very young by Afanasy Ivanovich Totsky, a wealthy nobleman who, under the pretext of educating her in European arts and languages, was actually grooming her to be exploited when she reached maturity. What began as guardianship ended in abuse of power. When the novel begins, she carries the indelible social mark of the fallen woman, a label that society assigns but never removes. Men of high society desire her sexually with an intensity proportional to her exceptional beauty, while they despise her morally for exactly the same reason. She represents the forbidden that they can consume without social consequences for themselves. Elite women exclude her from respectable circles while secretly envying the male attention she monopolizes. She exists in a perfectly calibrated social limbo, too beautiful to be ignored, too stained to be accepted as an equal, too rich to be completely discarded, but not respectable enough for true integration. Everyone wants her in some way, whether as a sexual object, as a trophy, as an interesting scandal, as a redemption project, but no one respects her as a complete moral agent. No one, except Mishkin. He sees her for the first time in a photograph, and immediately recognizes not the beauty everyone comments on, but the suffering no one mentions. When they finally meet, he speaks to her as if she were a complete human being, not an object of desire, not a charity case, not a social scandal. Just a person who suffered injustices and deserves to be seen in her fundamental dignity. And this pure love is absolutely unbearable for her. Here's the paradox that Dostoevsky understood and that therapists take years to explain to patients. Deeply wounded people develop tolerance for pain, but they don't develop the capacity to receive healthy love. Nastasia was so corrupted by interactions where everyone wanted something from her, sex, status, scandal, that disinterested love seems alien, threatening, impossible to be true. When Mishkin says he loves her unconditionally, she interprets it as, he's too naive to see who I really am. When he offers egalitarian marriage, she thinks, he pities me, and that's humiliating. When he forgives her cruelty, she concludes, he's too weak to truly face me. She literally doesn't have a mental category to process love that doesn't charge a price. So she runs away, repeatedly. She chooses Rogozhin, a man who desires her with sick, obsessive, possessive passion. A man she knows is dangerous, and that danger is comforting because it makes sense. Destructive passion is the language the world taught her. Redemptive love is a foreign language she'll never learn to speak. If you're over 40, you've probably witnessed this tragedy. You've known someone, maybe you even were someone, incapable of accepting healthy love. People who sabotage functional relationships because the absence of drama seems boring. Who interpret kindness as weakness stable partners as boring, consistent affection as a trap. They're not foolish. They were trained, experience by experience, to distrust everything that doesn't hurt. Society corrupted her so completely that she can no longer receive the only thing that would save her, and then it condemns her for failing to be saved. Mishkin's presence in high society functions as a chemical reagent that reveals the true moral composition of each person. The Yapanchin family represents the top of the social pyramid. Generals, imperial connections, European education, well-documented philanthropy. They are, by all public standards, good people. When Aglaya, the youngest daughter, becomes interested in Mishkin, the family tolerates it. He's a prince after all, even if impoverished and eccentric. There's pedigree, there's title. They can work with that. Family conversations revolve around how to domesticate his eccentricities, how to make him presentable, how to transform him into a suitable husband. But when Mishkin demonstrates genuine intention to help Nastasia, to treat her as an equal, to consider her worthy of public defense, the Yapanchin's true morality emerges. They destroy him socially. They mobilize the complete network of aristocratic gossip to ensure he's seen as inadequate, unstable, dangerous to the family reputation. And they do all this feeling virtuous, protecting their innocent daughter from the man who doesn't understand social realities. Dostoevsky exposes the complete mechanics. The violence of the virtuous is always executed in the name of elevated values. They don't hurt for pleasure. They hurt out of moral duty. And that's the violence against which there's no defense, because it comes disguised as protection, as prudence, as love. Mishkin has a terrible gift. He sees people suffering even when they build facades to hide it. Ganya pretends confident ambition, but Mishkin sees the young man terrified by his own mediocrity. Nastasia performs cynical indifference, but Mishkin sees the woman destroyed by years of objectification. Rogozhin displays possessive passion, but Mishkin sees the man consumed by obsession he doesn't even understand himself, and he offers compassion. Not unsolicited advice, not moralizing judgments disguised as concern, just recognition. I see your suffering. You're not alone in it. It should be a gesture of kindness, but it functions as violation. People have a right to their masks. We spend years building personas that function in the world, edited versions of ourselves that can operate without exposing all the painful complexity we carry internally. When someone sees through those masks without permission, even with pure intentions, it's invasive. Imagine you're going through a deep existential crisis, doubt about your work, your marriage, your life choices, but you need to function. So you put on the mask of person who's fine, go to work, smile in meetings, answer everything's great when asked. And then someone looks in your eyes and says, "You're not fine, I see that." Even if it's true, even if it's said with kindness, there's violation in that act. You didn't authorize being seen that way. Mishkin doesn't understand this boundary. His compassion is involuntary, automatic. He can't not see, can't not care, and that makes people hate him. Not despite his kindness, but because of it. When kindness ignores people's right to hide their pain, it becomes violence. That's the paradox. Dostoevsky is asking a sophisticated philosophical question here. Can there be compassion that respects autonomy? Or does every attempt to truly see and help the other necessarily invade spaces that the person has a right to keep private? An easy answer would be convenient. What we have is the brutal recognition. Even pure virtue hurts when it ignores the boundaries people establish for self-preservation. And here we arrive at the harshest truth of the idiot. Mishkin, with all his authentic kindness, doesn't save anyone. Nastasia meets her tragic fate at Rogozhin's hands. Rogozhin ends up condemned to prison in Siberia. Aglaya, wounded by Mishkin's rejection, impulsively marries a Polish adventurer who deceives and abandons her. Ganya remains trapped in embittered mediocrity, never achieving the ambitions for which he sacrificed his dignity to pursue. Ippolit, the young nihilistic consumptive whom Mishkin tries to console, dies in despair without ever finding the meaning he sought. Everyone Mishkin tries to love, understand, redeem, everyone is destroyed or self-destructs. His kindness doesn't work. His kindness is authentic. But individual kindness doesn't defeat structures built on systemic cruelty. Dostoevsky destroys the comforting fantasy that permeates our culture. The idea that kindness wins in the end, that love conquers all, that being a good person is enough. Formula: there isn't one. You do everything right and still watch those you love destroy themselves. Because the world doesn't work like a moral fairy tale. Good intentions don't guarantee good results. Pure love doesn't heal deep social wounds. Individual compassion doesn't dismantle systems of oppression. This perception should be liberating, but it's devastating, because it means there's no clear path. You can do everything morally right and still fail to save those you love. Kindness ceases to be a guarantee of results and becomes just a choice you make, knowing it probably won't be enough. In middle age, this is no longer theory. It's a scar. They tried to save their partner from addiction. They failed. They tried to rescue their child from destructive choices. They failed. They tried to reform corrupted institutions from within. They failed. And then they have to confront the question: if kindness doesn't guarantee results, what's the purpose of being good? Dostoevsky doesn't offer a comforting answer, just an observation. Maybe the purpose isn't to win. Maybe it's just to witness, to be present in others' suffering, knowing you can't eliminate it, to offer compassion knowing it might not be accepted, to try knowing you'll probably fail, because the alternative, complete cynicism, abandonment of the attempt, is to surrender to the world exactly as it is, without even registering resistance. Mishkin's epilepsy functions as more than biographical detail. Dostoevsky, himself an epileptic, uses the condition as a spiritual metaphor. During seizures, in the seconds before the convulsion, Mishkin experiences what he describes as transcendent illumination. Moments of absolute understanding where everything makes sense, where universal love is tangible, where the separation between him and the rest of existence dissolves into pure unity. He says, "For this moment, I would give my entire life," and immediately adds, "but maybe it's just a symptom of the disease." He doesn't know if they're genuine mystical experiences or just abnormal electrical activity in the brain. And Dostoevsky purposely doesn't resolve this ambiguity, because the question isn't whether the experiences are real in the objective sense. The question is the cost. To achieve these moments of transcendent clarity, Mishkin pays with convulsions, loss of consciousness, gradual deterioration of his cognitive capacities. To experience kindness and love in absolute form, he needs to exit functional reality. Sainthood and sanity are incompatible. Think of anyone you know who lives according to radical moral principles. Activists who dedicate their lives to causes to the detriment of their own financial and mental health. Contemplative religious people who abandon worldly ambition. Artists who choose creative integrity over commercial success. There's always a cost. Always. You can't maintain absolute moral purity and also have a comfortable life, thriving career, social stability. The demands are contradictory. Society tacitly recognizes this when it categorizes these people as extremists, idealists, impractical. We admire from a distance, but don't imitate up close, because we instinctively understand living according to radical kindness requires sacrificing social functionality, and most of us, rightfully, aren't willing to make that sacrifice. Dostoevsky isn't romanticizing madness. He's diagnosing fundamental incompatibility. The world as currently structured doesn't accommodate people who live absolute kindness. They need to be domesticated, marginalized, or destroyed so the system continues functioning. And calling this disease is just the way society found to pathologize what it can't assimilate. Ippolit is a 19-year-old dying of tuberculosis. He writes his essential explanation, a nihilistic manifesto arguing that in a universe without God, without transcendent purpose, where everyone dies and is forgotten, life is absurd. Kindness is illusion. Morality is arbitrary social construction. Nothing matters. He reads this to Mishkin expecting some refutation, some theological argument, some easy philosophical consolation. But Mishkin simply listens. He doesn't debate, doesn't try to convert, doesn't offer platitudes about everything happens for a reason. He just acknowledges, your suffering is real. Your despair makes sense given what you're experiencing. I won't pretend to have answers that eliminate your pain. This scene shows a difference between performative kindness and authentic kindness. Performative kindness would need to win. Convince Ippolit he's wrong. Save him from nihilism. Have the last philosophical word. Authentic kindness just witnesses. Sits with the person in their despair without trying to control it, without trying to transform it into an edifying lesson, without needing it to end well. It's kindness that tolerates ambiguity. That can look at the abyss, the real possibility that suffering is meaningless, that there's no cosmic justice, that sometimes good people just suffer and die without redemption, and still choose compassion. Not because compassion changes the reality of suffering, but because it's the only possible human response to it. Ippolit attempts a desperate act after the reading. He fails. He spends the following months until his natural death being cared for by Mishkin, who never mentions the nihilistic text, never tries to argue against it, just offers presence. Ippolit dies without conversion, without a happy ending. The moral lesson, if it exists, remains opaque. There are just two human beings sharing space briefly before one of them ceases to exist. Dostoevsky knew something that contemporary self-improvement culture forgets. Some forms of kindness don't produce measurable results. They don't change behaviors, don't save lives, don't solve problems. They just exist as acts in themselves, with no purpose beyond being executed. Maybe that's enough, or maybe it isn't. There's no certainty. During a party at the Yapanchin's house, Mishkin has an epileptic seizure in public. Until then, high society tolerated his eccentricities. He was the half-strange but harmless prince, source of curious anecdotes. But in the seizure, he completely loses physical control, oscillating between lucidity and incoherence. He ceases to be entertainment and becomes embarrassment, evidence that there's something genuinely wrong, unpredictable, dangerous. The reaction is immediate. The same people who days before performed affection for him, the dear eccentric prince, turn their backs. Conversations are cut short, visits are cancelled, invitations stop arriving. Within weeks, he's completely excluded from the social circles that seem to have accepted him. Dostoevsky exposes the complete mechanics of performative charity. Society tolerates difference only as long as it's decorative, controllable, not too inconvenient. It tolerates the charming idiot who says naive but fundamentally harmless truths. It doesn't tolerate real illness, uncontrollable vulnerability, suffering that demands genuine response instead of abstract sympathy. Think about how we treat people with mental disabilities, chronic illnesses, conditions that disturb social order. We perform inclusion in awareness campaigns, use politically correct language, say that everyone deserves dignity. But when confronted with the messy reality, unpredictable behaviors, constant needs, inability to reciprocate socially, most people pull away. Because Instagram compassion is cheap. Compassion that demands real sacrifice of time, comfort, convenience is too expensive for most to pay. The Yapanchins don't feel cruel abandoning Mishkin. They feel prudent. After all, he needs professional care. It wouldn't be fair to Aglaya to tie her to someone so unstable. We did what we could, but there are limits. There's always a rational narrative available to justify abandonment. And Dostoevsky doesn't paint them as cartoonishly malignant villains. He paints them as ordinary people making ordinary choices of social self-preservation, which makes the criticism more devastating, because it means we're all the Yapanchins. We all have limits to how much suffering of others we're willing to witness before pulling away to protect our own peace. Rogozhin, consumed by obsessive passion and pathological jealousy, brings tragic fate to Nastasia. But Dostoevsky doesn't present this as a simple crime of passion. He constructs the scene with disturbing ambiguity. Nastasia spent the entire novel running from Mishkin and returning to Rogozhin. She knew, everyone knew, that Rogozhin was capable of this. She chose this danger repeatedly. Why? Dostoevsky suggests. Because this end at the hands of obsessive passion made sense to her. It was coherent with the narrative the world imposed on her. The fallen woman, the dangerous object of desire, the femme fatale who destroys men and is destroyed by them. Being saved by Mishkin's pure love would be living in permanent incoherence. It would be waking up every day, not believing she deserved that love, waiting for the moment when he realized who she really was, and abandoned her. The anxiety of that wait would be worse than the end itself. So she chooses this path. Not actively, she doesn't commit suicide, but passively. She repeatedly puts herself in a situation where violent outcome is a probable result. And when it finally happens, there's almost relief in the inevitability. It was always the possible ending. Now at least she doesn't have to wait for it anymore. Dostoevsky is working with a concept that psychology would only formalize decades later: repetition compulsion. Traumatized people tend to recreate patterns that hurt them because at least they're known patterns. Family abuse is terrifying but predictable. Healthy love is comforting but alien. And the fear of the unknown can be greater than the fear of familiar pain. Some people were so completely destroyed by the world that self-destruction is the only coherent narrative they can accept. And the society that destroyed them then condemns their inability to be saved as personal moral failure. We gave her so many chances. He just didn't want help. If she really wanted to change, she would. As if individual will was sufficient against years of traumatic conditioning. After what happened, Mishkin finds Rogozhin sitting beside Nastasia's body. The scene is one of the most disturbing in world literature. Rogozhin is in a state of dissociative shock, oscillating between lucidity and feverish delirium. Mishkin could scream, call authorities, react with horror and moral condemnation. It would be the expected, socially appropriate response. Instead, he lies down beside Rogozhin. He holds his hand. He spends the entire night there, consoling the man who just took the life of the woman they both loved. Not performatively. There's no audience. There are no witnesses who could admire his magnanimity. Just two men in the dark, one of them trembling with fever and guilt, the other offering silent presence. Dostoevsky forces the reader to confront: is this kindness or madness? Authentic compassion or absence of healthy moral boundaries? The question remains unanswered because maybe there is no answer. Maybe true compassion always looks like madness to those who live within the normal moral categories of good versus bad, victim versus guilty, who deserves empathy versus who deserves punishment. Mishkin recognizes in Rogozhin not a moral monster, but a human being who was consumed by psychological forces he himself didn't completely control. Obsessive passion transformed into possession, jealousy transformed into paranoia, fear of loss transformed into preventive violence. Rogozhin didn't wake up one day and rationally decide to become this. He was carried by an increasingly strong emotional current, to the point where the only exit his consumed brain could process was elimination of the source of his torture. This doesn't make the act acceptable. It doesn't eliminate moral responsibility, but it adds layers of understanding that go beyond simplistic condemnation. And Mishkin, incapable of thinking in binary categories, simply recognizes, this could be me in other circumstances. We all carry internal abysses. The difference between me and you isn't that I'm good and you're bad. It's that factors neither of us completely controlled led us to different manifestations of our human potential for destruction. This is the compassion that terrifies society of the virtuous, because it dissolves the boundaries that allow us to feel safe in our own goodness. If even those who committed the worst deserve compassion, if even the most serious crimes can be understood as the result of complex human circumstances, then no one is safe in the category of good person who would never do this. We're all capable of everything under sufficient pressure, and recognizing this is too terrible for most to bear. In the devastating ending, Mishkin regresses completely. He loses the capacity for coherent speech, doesn't recognize familiar faces, becomes catatonic. He's taken back to the Swiss sanatorium from where he came. The attempt to live absolute kindness in the real world destroyed him totally. He didn't die physically, but ceased to exist as a functional person. Dostoevsky offers no redemption. There's no epilogue where we discover that Mishkin's kindness planted seeds that eventually flourished. There are no secondary characters who learned from him and became better. Everyone continues in their mediocre or tragic lives, and Mishkin simply disappears from the story, forgotten. The message is, absolute kindness and functional existence in the world are incompatible. You can choose one or the other, but not both. Either you compromise your moral ideals enough to navigate social reality, learning when to lie, when to be cruel, when to protect yourself at others' expense, or you maintain moral purity and are crushed by the social machinery that wasn't built to accommodate saints. Those who've lived long enough already know, kindness doesn't guarantee results. They've already yielded on principles they swore were non-negotiable. They've already acted with necessary cruelty. They've already chosen silence when they should have spoken, or their own safety when they should have taken risks. They're not weak. They learned through painful years that moral purity charges a price, and most can't pay. Social isolation, financial instability, constant emotional cost of living against the current. And then comes the question that haunts: if we can't be absolutely good, what version of kindness is possible? If we need to lie sometimes, be strategic sometimes, protect ourselves sometimes, where do we draw the line? How much can we compromise before becoming the same people we criticize? Dostoevsky has no answer. The Idiot isn't a self-help book with 5 steps to sustainable kindness. It's a diagnosis of the human condition without a cure. But maybe there's wisdom in accepting that, in recognizing that kindness isn't a state you achieve and maintain, but a series of imperfect choices you make day after day, knowing you'll constantly fail. Maybe the only honest kindness recognizes its own impossibility, without performance of purity, without pretending to have answers it doesn't have, without feeling superior to those who failed differently. Kindness with radical humility. You're also capable of cruelty, product of forces you didn't choose, navigating a system where absolute kindness doesn't survive. Mishkin failed to save those he loved, but he tried. He saw suffering and didn't turn his back out of convenience. He witnessed human abysses without feeling morally superior. He offered compassion, knowing it probably wouldn't be enough. And maybe, in a world where absolute kindness is impossible, this imperfect attempt is the maximum integrity we can honestly claim. The question isn't how to be perfectly good, it's how to keep trying to be minimally decent knowing the world doesn't reward it, knowing you'll fail, knowing it might not make a difference. And the only honest answer is, you don't know if it's worth it. You just know that the alternative, complete cynicism, abandonment of the attempt, makes the world a little worse. So you continue. Not because it guarantees results, but because it's the only gesture of resistance against systemic cruelty you can make. Dostoevsky ends The Idiot without resolving its contradictions. Mishkin is destroyed. Nastasia is dead. Rogozhin is condemned. Everyone else continues their petty lives. And yet the novel exists. Yet generations of readers have crossed through its pages and emerged different. Not because they learned how to be good, but because they were forced to confront that real kindness is infinitely more complex and dangerous than comforting narratives suggest. Maybe that's what literature does when done honestly. It doesn't offer solutions, but deepens understanding of the problem. It doesn't give answers about how to live, but shows why living well is so brutally difficult. And in this shared recognition of our collective moral inadequacy, maybe there's something like genuine compassion. Not because we believe we're good, but because we recognize we're all equally lost. Dostoevsky doesn't leave us an answer. He leaves us a wound. And maybe it's in that wound, and not in any certainty, that real humanity can be found. If you made it this far, you probably already understand. There are no perfectly good people. There are only people who keep trying despite knowing they'll fail. Dostoevsky didn't write a manual for kindness. He wrote an autopsy of why authentic kindness doesn't survive contact with reality. And maybe we need that diagnosis more than we need false hope.